Hello there, Bob.
Hello, Glenn. How are you?
You know, I'm pretty good. It's a gloomy day here in Providence, Rhode Island, but I'm feeling
Well, it's always
great.
gloomy in Providence, Rhode Island.
Not always.
Berkeley, California. See, if you had any sense, you would be out here on the West Coast in the East Bay, and I want to offer you a standing invitation to come out here.
Thank you, Robert. Actually, I've got plenty good sense, but I've also got a wife, and she's the problem. I'd already be out there, but for my wife's East Coast philia, which I don't know what to do about.
Well, you just show her the West Coast, and she'll convert.
I keep saying 300 days of sunshine a year. It's like adding 20% to your life, you know?
Glenn, seriously, my biggest regret is that I didn't come out here years ago. I mean, I just got out here 2 years ago. By the way, I'm using a clunky old technology telephone here. That comes from the actually it's vintage 1950s, maybe 1940s.
Should I talk louder then?
The last time I did this blogger ads, I got a lot of emails. I think more emails about this clunky old telephone that I had in my hand than anything else. So I want to get that out of the way. No more emails about my telephone.
Okay, good. The audience has been well informed. I saw a photograph of you taken by this guy. He's a Boston photographer. I'm afraid I don't remember his name, but I don't know how you could ever forget the photograph. You seem to have no clothes on, but are covered with various pieces of fruit and other kinds of vegetation in some surreal photograph of Robert Reich. How did you allow that to happen?
Well,
do you know what I'm talking about?
That's part of the vast right-wing conspiracy.
It's one of those computer-generated...
I did not possibly. No, actually, that was a photograph. I got snookered. I got somebody called me and said, "Look, we have a charity operation, a calendar, and we want you to participate in this charity calendar."
That's what it was,
right? Nude, and we'll have Yo-Yo Ma and everybody, everybody, all these, and Alan Dershowitz and everybody from Cambridge to support public television. No, it was a community channel, community television. In
that
Cambridge.
explains
I said, do I have to really get naked? And they said, "Well, no, you can, you can look like you're naked. You're not really naked." And I said, "All right." And
you were very effectively appearing to be naked.
And there were no
covered with fruit.
And there were no other. Yo-Yo Ma was not there, and Alan Dershowitz was not there, and in fact there was the only people that showed up was beyond the cameraman was somebody from CNN, and I said, "Well, what are you doing?" And the CNN person said, "Well, we're just here," and I said, "Well, I don't want you to take this because I don't want to appear any place but the calendar." And the CNN person said, "Well, that's perfectly fine. We're just doing publicity for the calendar." And of course, within 24 hours, there I was in my, altogether unflagrante, whatever it is.
Not quite unflagrante.
Not quite unflagrante. But, that just goes to show you can't trust anybody in this world anymore.
Well, I'm telling you, the guy now passes around these little postcard-like replicas as almost like a business card. It's like he's advertising, "I am an extraordinary photographer. Look what I've got here." And it's very effective.
You tell him if he's anywhere within sight of this conversation, tell him I'm just about to sue him.
Right. So, Mr. Former Secretary, I've been hearing you on the various cable things and whatnot, holding forth on matters economic policy and so forth. What do you think with a recession looming and subprime mortgage crisis and all of that? Where do things stand and how can it be fixed?
Well, Glenn, you're an economist. I mean, I certainly would like to kind of toss this around with you. I think things look very bad. Now, the optimists are saying we're going to be out of this by the end of this year, and that the little stimulus package checks that are going out in the next couple of weeks are going to actually make a difference. I don't think so at all. I don't think we are going to be out of this later this year. I think it's going to be a tough, possibly 2009. I don't think these little checks are going to do any good at all. I mean, oil prices, fuel prices keep on going up. In fact, they've obliterated whatever benefit these checks had. People are deep in debt. Housing prices are going down, continue to drop. You know the whole story. Yeah. This is a consumer-led recession, unlike the last three. And I think even if the Fed does reduce interest rates again this week, which I'm not sure it will, maybe a quarter percentage point at most, but there are a lot of inflationary winds as well as the recessionary or perish the thought, depressionary winds, headwinds. I think the Fed may think better of just decide not to reduce interest rates. So a lot of it comes down to fiscal policy, and but I'm talking about a bigger stimulus package than we've had. I would say
$600 a month. What is it? $600 per taxpayer. That's not going to do very much. It starts at
$300 and goes up to $1,200 in terms of the checks that are checks are in the mail.
I
think most people are going to use those checks to pay down their debt, or use the checks not in ways that are necessarily going to stimulate the economy. And I think we probably need to be serious about a bigger stimulus package, which would include both tax cuts and spending increases. Tax cuts for lower middle, working class, relatively poor people, probably involving cuts in the payroll tax, which most people are paying. In fact, 80% of Americans pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes.
Sure. Have I not been hearing the Democratic candidates talking about raising taxes, and even one of them, Mr. Obama, Senator Obama, talking about raising the payroll tax?
He's talking about saving Social Security by possibly raising the cap on the percentage of income subjected to Social Security. It's now $100,000, and he hasn't specified exactly where he would raise the cap, perhaps on people making over $250,000. That's not going to slow the economy down. Glenn, you know that rich people spend all they want. That's the definition of being rich. What we want to do is, if anything, think about reducing temporarily payroll taxes on lower income people. For example, one possibility would be to exempt the first $15,000 of income from payroll taxes for the next year. This would not bankrupt Social Security, but it might it would stimulate the economy.
Doesn't sound like a bad idea to do that on a permanent basis or something like that. Isn't this I shouldn't say isn't. I know that it is a very regressive tax. A flat rate percentage on the first, about $96,000 or something like that earned?
It's $99,000 last time I looked.
Yeah.
It's a regressive tax in terms of paying into Social Security. Conservatives often argue that it's not regressive in terms of the payout, because the payouts are quite progressive, relative to what your normal income was. I think Social Security usually pays about 40% of your pre-retirement income, but if you were very wealthy, it pays far less. If you earned a very, very large amount during your working years on a yearly basis, it pays far less than 40%, and it pays more than 40% if you earned far less. But then you could argue, on the other hand, Social Security is still regressive because the poor don't live as long as people who've had good health care. So I think it's on. If you look overall, it is a fairly regressive system, and so I'm glad you agree with me that maybe exempting the first $15,000 of income from Social Security payroll taxes might be a good thing to do permanently.
It sounds like a plausible thing to me, although, as you know, I'm not that kind of economist, so I haven't run the numbers on it. But I've always thought a couple of things about Social Security. One is that this fiction, or near fiction, that it's a pure you pay in and you get back what you paid, which was a ideological cover necessary to get the program enacted. But I've always thought it had outlived its usefulness, that this is basically a social insurance program, and that there's nothing wrong with the idea that people might get back, quote, more, close quote, than they paid in if they've come out on the relative losing end of the income lottery in life. And there's nothing wrong with the idea that people with very high incomes might pay more into the old age insurance program than they would get out on an actuarial basis as part of their appropriate contribution to the social compact from which they have benefited greatly. So I know that may be left of what's acceptable in American political discourse, but it always seems self-evident to me.
Well, it seems self-evident to me, too, and I was interested that John McCain, in his recent economic speech, the one thing that sounded actually quite sensible to me, most of it didn't make any sense. It was just tax cutting with no way of paying for it. But one thing that did make sense was his suggestion, more than a suggestion, he actually came out and said we're going to means test Medicare, or at least Medicare, I guess it was Medicare Part B. And there is that makes a lot of sense. More means testing. The rich pay much more than they do now, or significantly more than they do now. That's wise. I don't know if you remember the old saw about Franklin D. Roosevelt when my predecessor at the Labor Department, Frances Perkins, who came up with Social Security and the idea, she went to him and said, Mr. President, you don't need to emphasize that everybody pays into their own Social Security account. In fact, it doesn't make much sense to even have individual Social Security accounts because it's a pay-as-you-go system.
Right.
And, you know, it's obviously the Social Security recipients who get their money are getting it from today's workers. So rather than talk about Social Security accounts, we ought to talk about realistically how it works intergenerationally. It's a transfer.
And FDR said,
Franklin D. Roosevelt said back to Frances Perkins, no, we're not going to do that way. They'll do it that way. I want people to think that they have their own accounts because I want to make sure that those sons of bitches on Capitol Hill can never get rid of this program.
Yeah, okay.
And he was right.
There was some wisdom in that, yeah. There was some wisdom in that.
He understood politics.
Yeah. So, what did you think about the Bear Stearns bailout?
Well, I understand why the Fed had to do it in terms of avoiding
some
possibility of runs on banks. It was an insurance policy. I'm not comfortable with the outcome, though, Glenn, because I don't think there's any quid pro quo. I mean, these big investment banks on Wall Street don't have to increase their reserves, their capital reserves. They can be as highly leveraged as they ever have been, but now they're backstopped by you and me and other taxpayers. The Fed and or Congress needs to, as soon as possible, increase the capital requirements for these big investment banks because now they're being treated just like any commercial bank in terms of being backstopped by taxpayers. And it's absurd. We're setting ourselves up for some real taxpayer losses. If the investment bankers get everything on the upside in terms of not taking any risks, they'll get all the upside gains on any risk they take, but none of the downside losses because taxpayers are standing there to hold the bag if there are any losses. We're setting ourselves up for a bigger problem than we had before.
Yeah, so it seems to me as well, and I heard some pretty smart financial economists talking about this in terms of what they call the moral hazard problem, the incentives that are engendered by bailing out and creating the expectation that, we're too big to fail going forward. So people will make decisions and take risk with the idea in mind that should the worst actually come to pass, we know that we're too big to fail. We know that likely the Fed's going to step in because the domino falling consequences of financial failure at various institutions could be really bad for the economy. And I agree, and so did these really smart financial economists that I heard talking about this, that there ought to have been, and there's still yet the possibility for stricter regulation that comes along with this to try to counteract that problem.
It's interesting. Wall Street has, as I'm sure you know, Glenn, Wall Street has extraordinary lobbying power in Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that many months ago when Congress noticed that a lot of private equity managers were paying income taxes, actually taxes, at a capital gains rate, 15%, because they could so easily treat their income as capital gains.
Yeah.
And Congress said, well, this isn't fair. You're making $500 million, or some of you are making $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion a year. Average Americans are paying 20 or 30 or 30% marginal tax rate. You guys are paying 15%. and let's raise you to the highest marginal tax rate now in effect, which is 35%. And they beat, the Wall Street beat that back. That would have been
I know. I saw Chuck Schumer.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say I saw Chuck Schumer out front leading the Wall Street charge on that. I said, isn't this a liberal Democrat? I mean, what's up with this? Oh, he's the senator from New York. I understand.
Well, I didn't see Hillary Rodham Clinton, the other senator from New York.
I didn't mean to exclude her. Fair enough.
Advancing the cause of average taxpayers. I mean, these Wall Street has huge clout. This would have been $32 billion a year that could have helped out reducing the taxes of average Americans.
So now you were a colleague of Robert Rubin, the extraordinary Secretary of Treasury. At least so is his reputation. Where does he stand on these issues? I thought he was a relatively enlightened Wall Street guru.
Well, I think he is quite enlightened. As I understood it, he said it was that this income ought to be treated as ordinary income and not as capital gains. I have very high respect for Bob Rubin. He got I don't understand where and what he was doing when Citigroup got involved in all of these derivatives. And what kind of oversight he exercised. I think there was a piece in the wall in the.
Did you see it? Yeah, in the New York Times business section on Sunday, it was amazing. Here's Bob Rubin spread all across the page. What happened at Citigroup? Was he on the job or what? Is pretty much what the headline said.
I mean, he has a kind of ambivalent position there.
Yeah.
As what is a chairman of the executive committee. But you would think, and again, I don't want to be understood to be criticizing Bob Rubin.
Yeah.
I admire Bob Rubin. He was a colleague of mine and a friend, and he is a friend. But you would expect that these people who are in charge of these big financial houses would have been minding the story. They didn't even know what derivatives and what securities they were engaged in. They were complicated, and a lot of them, even when I talked to them over the last couple of years, they shrug their shoulders. They say, well, we don't understand, but we're making a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, I heard this guy, his name is Jerry Corrigan. He's the chairman of the risk management group at the committee at Goldman Sachs. And he was up here talking to these financial economists and me a few weeks ago. And this was one of his main points. These instruments are so hard to understand. These derivatives and these sort of secondary and tertiary, the securitization of just about everything moving. They're so complex that it's difficult for anybody to really know what's going on, which is kind of scary.
Well, of course, if they're betting other people's money, that's why we've got to increase capital requirements.
Yeah,
these investment banks put up their own money. We've got to make sure that their compensation systems reflect, the real gains and losses that they experience. Now, they just enjoy the upside gains. We are. It's a huge casino in which the biggest players making the most money basically get home free, and the rest of us, small investors or people who are not investing, are getting clobbered. This is why so many people in this country are so frustrated now, or angry, or a little bit worried, or even, do I dare say the word, bitter?
No, I don't think you should say that word. I think it should be said here that the shareholders at Bear Stearns are not feeling like they got over on the American people. They're feeling like they lost a lot of money, which I'm sure
the
they
shareholders
did.
at Bear Stearns, that's right. But the top executives of Bear Stearns, some of them are going on to other big jobs. The J.P. Morgan top executives who enjoyed a lot of the bailout that taxpayers provided in terms of this almost riskless money, they're doing better than ever.
Yeah, indeed. So I have to ask you, Bob, you've come out, I hear, endorsing Barack Obama, and you've been a friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton's for, 35 years? How's that feel?
It doesn't feel good in the sense that I didn't want to do it, Glenn. I really was not going to endorse anybody. I told myself I'm very impressed with Barack Obama as a candidate. I had met with him. I love the effect he's having on people who had become very cynical with the political process, getting young people involved. I mean, if we're ever going to get this democracy back, we've got to inspire people again. I think his policies are more sensible than Hillary Clinton's policies. But I wasn't going to endorse. And then I was so, well, I guess the only way of putting it is I was so appalled at her campaign, the tone of the campaign, the negativism.
This is questioning, let me just ask you specifically, it's about questioning his capacity to serve as Commander-in-Chief?
Well, that started it, suggesting that John McCain or she would be better as a Commander-in-Chief than would Barack Obama. It's the first time I ever remember a Democratic candidate or any candidate in a primary suggesting that the opposing party's candidate would be better than his or her own primary opponent. And then also continuing to beat Barack Obama over the head with all sorts of things. You know, the Reverend Reich comments with the kind of guilt by association, anybody else that she could find, the suggestions that he wasn't patriotic, the suggestions that he wasn't electable, some of the racial, not so subtle racial statements that I heard coming out of South Carolina that I was very concerned about. You know, Bill Clinton, to my way of thinking, not improving his image, not serving his legacy, not helping American politics become a better arena in which large issues could be discussed, but really playing the same kind of games, both Bill and Hillary, that the Republicans had played on the two of them in the 1990s. It was almost as if, particularly when I heard the ads about Barack Obama's inadvertent and I think regrettable gaffes, and they have to be gaffes, I mean he doesn't feel this way, about guns and religion, just using the Republican playbook from the 1990s on Barack Obama that had been used on Bill and Hillary. Well,
So you were driven to the end.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, you say, I read you then as saying you were driven to making a public endorsement by, I don't know, a sense of disgust that you had at the way they were conducting their campaign.
Yes, I didn't want to do it, but that's exactly right. I was driven to it.
Well, I should say, I mean, just by way of full disclosure, I have a very different view of the matter. I didn't take the remarks that Bill Clinton made in South Carolina to be playing a race card at all. I thought and still think he was making, if inartfully, a fairly straightforward statement, which was that if you get 90 or 95% of the black vote in an electorate where blacks are a third or more of the voters, that's a tremendous advantage for the candidate. I thought that was a true statement. Why should that be somehow...
I think in South Carolina, the comment that kind of felt, a lot of people felt was quite remarkable coming from Bill Clinton was his remark about Jesse Jackson won South Carolina. Well,
that's what I mean by saying it. He didn't say it well, but it would have been better to say what I just said. If you get if you got a solid block of the electorate voting for you, then your winning doesn't necessarily measure your strength as a candidate overall. Comparing him to Jesse Jackson made it sound.
The point is that Bill Clinton doesn't say things inartfully that he doesn't intend to say.
Okay, so now we're going to his motive.
He's a consummate politician. He knew exactly what he was saying. And again, that was just one step along the road for me. I was not going to, I said on my blog, I criticized him, but there have been too many of those, both from Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, not with regard to race so much, although I think a lot of the comments about Reverend Wright and the continued hammering about Reverend Wright do have racial overtones, but it's all the other stuff.
But again, I have to say,
religion and everything else.
Yeah, I have to say, my perception is really quite different. I thought the hammering about the Reverend Wright stuff, quite apart from the role that it plays in the competition between Hillary and Clinton and Barack Obama, had the effect of a kind of vetting process. I mean, the hammering is going to come sooner or later. These are questions that won't go away, right? So, isn't the party done a service by having these matters raised? Would the party, in other words, not have been done a disservice if the campaign amongst the Democrats were to avoid these issues and leave them laying there undeveloped and so on for the Republicans to exploit? What's wrong with asking about the Reverend Wright matter, since the Reverend Wright matter is quite obviously salient?
Because Barack Obama gave a speech that I think was a brilliant speech. I'd be very interested in your views on that, about race in America, in which he put the Reverend Wright's comments in context and asked that people understand that Reverend Wright has been at his job for 30 years, that he's given 3 sermons a day for 30 years, that comments that are taken out of context really cannot be understood to be not only where Reverend Wright comes from, but certainly not where Barack Obama comes from, and also that people have to understand that there is a great deal of anger in the black church, reflecting the position that blacks have had in American society, but again, understanding it in context, and understanding the context of a lot of white anger when it comes to seeing blacks who get affirmative action or who seem to be in a privileged position that a lot of poor whites are not in. That is Barack Obama's attempt to put all of that in context. Seems to me to have been enormously important and successful in elevating the debate, and then to have his primary opponent go back and hammer him as if he never had made that speech, not bringing up any of the themes in the speech, going back to gutter mudslinging politics, emulating the Republicans, and I agree with you, it's what the Republicans are likely to do. Why do that? Why not dignify American politics the way Barack Obama tried to? Why not have a sophisticated debate, if you're going to have one, about race or about the frustrations of white working class America? Why not really do what he tried to do or tried to start to do instead of just play the old politics?
Okay, let me tell you what I thought about the speech. I did think it was a brilliant speech, a courageous speech. And I thought when I saw it, this guy, not only is he an intellectual, and not only is he a very shrewd and effective politician, but he has character. I was awfully glad that he didn't, as they say, throw Reverend Wright under the bus. There were some soaring moments of rhetoric in the speech that genuinely stirred me. On the other hand, I didn't think the speech dealt effectively with what I thought was the core issue. And the core issue in my mind was that, yes, there is a lot of anger amongst African Americans, and it has congealed in institutional form in places like the South Side of Chicago, in institutions like the Trinity United Church of Christ, and also in institutions like the Nation of Islam. And, I'm not trying to, paint Reverend Wright with any kind of aspersion here. I'm not trying to denigrate or anything like that, but I simply want to observe that the ideas that were given voice in some of those sound bites, which were taken out of context, but when you listen to the whole sermon, you understand that there's a deep critique of the American order that was being articulated there. No, I don't think it was unpatriotic by any means, and I don't think it was racist by any means, but it is nevertheless a deep critique. Those ideas are a reflection of the life experience of, 750,000 African Americans living on the South Side. That's the very same life experience that's reflected in the many thousands of followers of, I'm going to say the name again, Louis Farrakhan. And again, I'm not casting aspersions. But when Barack Obama treated that as if it was some kind of aberration, when he said of Reverend Wright, well, you see, he's of a certain generation, they misunderstand America, they don't understand that, what's good about America and so forth and so on, and then he went on to say, they even go so far as blaming the problems of the Middle East on our friend and ally Israel instead of on, and I can't remember the exact words, well, there was something about the perverse and bizarre or hateful ideologies of Islam. They make a mistake, and I stand here to say that I don't share that mistake with them, and we should understand where that mistake comes from. And when I heard that, I felt very disappointed, because in the first, as I say, I thought it was kind of patronizing. Reverend Wright is not ignorant of the history of what has happened. That's not the problem, that he doesn't understand what a younger generation of people do understand about this country. He has a deep critique of the country. Barack Obama, in my mind, ought to have either agreed with that critique, and something tells me that he just might agree with it since he sat in the church for quite so long, or he ought to have refuted it. And secondly,
Glenn, 2 points. Number one,
okay, go on.
I have heard him refute that again and again and again. But number two, we're dealing with the old issue, the old politics of guilt by association. I mean, I've had friends, including mentors and religious leaders who I've sat in their congregations for years, with whom I completely disagree. I had dinner the other night with one of my best friends, Alan K. Simpson, Republican of Wyoming, and he and I disagree about everything. But
you guys used to be go on, I'm sorry.
But my point is that once we play the kind of gutter, mudslinging old politics of guilt by association, we are no longer dealing with real issues of what somebody is going to do in office, how they're going to be acting as president. We're dealing with who they might have heard, or whose congregation they might have been in, or whose friends they might have been. Hillary Clinton and John McCain, if you had a list of all of the people who they hung around with consistently over the last 30 years, and you asked yourself, are there any questionable characters on either of those lists? You would say, of course, there's some real people I don't want to come close to the White House. And
I agree with
what they believe.
I'm sorry, Bob. I agree with what you're saying on that, and there is something just very distasteful about the guilt by association argument. I don't want to be understood as making it here, but I do want to say this, and I wonder how you would react to it. A lot of people that I talk to who are fervent Obama supporters, and they include African Americans, but extend beyond, say to me when I complain about the lack of ideological edge in the Obama candidacy. This is a criticism that I associate with the columnist Paul Krugman, who's made this point on a number of occasions. But it basically says, look, we're Democrats in the tradition of FDR and LBJ, and yes, William Jefferson Clinton, and we're about something, and it's real different than what the Republicans are about. And all this business about transcending the ideological divide, all this criticizing the old politics as if you could invent a new politics just like that, all this talk of no more red states and blue states, et cetera, sort of concedes important ideological points that really ought to be argued out. And when I say that to fervent Obama supporters, they say to me, yeah, I know what you mean, but where he's really coming from is much more progressive than he's able to say right now. Sit tight, and when he gets elected, you'll see. Okay? Now, if there is that, I don't know what, somewhat lack of full transparency about political, ideological commitment because we're running a different kind of campaign and we have a different kind of image, then is it not fair game to ask, well, then what is the deep structure of commitment of a candidate? And since he's not telling us about his ideological commitment, since he's making statements like, Ronald Reagan was a transcendent politician who cut across the lines, and so am I, since he won't acknowledge what was successful about the 8 years of William Jefferson Clinton's presidency, which was a part of this Democratic pantheon, since he can't acknowledge it because of the competitive nature of the campaign, then why shouldn't people try to read the tea leaves and sort the entrails to try to figure out where he's really coming from? I'm just asking you.
Well, Glenn, I disagree with your premise. Okay. First of all, your premise that somehow transcendent politics or a new politics has got to be ideological in the old sense. I don't think that's the case. In fact, I think it's very important that if we're going to deal with any of the problems we have, global warming, terrorism, the widening inequality, lack of health care, lousy jobs for a lot of people, and so on, that we roll up our sleeves and put the old ideologies aside. It's not market versus government. It's not big government versus small government. It's not rich versus poor. It's not corporations versus the rest of us. It's not black versus white. It's not the old ideological divides. America is at its best when we put those those kind of frames to one side and say, well, what's the best way and the most practical way of dealing with this problem? And if we disagree, let's talk about specifically our disagreements. You and I used to have these kinds of arguments, and they're the best kind of arguments. But let me say just number two. If you think that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are ideologues or portray themselves as ideologues, you're wrong. I mean, Bill Clinton triangulated. Remember, notoriously in the 1990s, said he was not going to get near the Democrats or the Republicans. He was above ideological politics. Hillary Clinton brought Dick Morris and Mark Penn into the White House, two people that said, no, Bill Clinton, you've got to move right as fast as you possibly can. I mean, Hillary is... No, I was
there.
There's no ideology there. There's no sharp edge. John McCain, let me just finish this one point.
Yeah, you go ahead.
John McCain is moving to the left as fast as he can. He was down, in New Orleans. He's saying that he cares about ordinary folk and he cares about the poor. Ideology is not something that even if people have, they're going to necessarily wear on their sleeves during a presidential campaign. But let me just finish with my first point, again in a slightly different way. I think we need to get beyond the old ideological boxes.
But I don't understand how we're going to get beyond it, Bob. This is what I don't see. I mean, we started this conversation talking about big money people on Wall Street, the influence they have on the U.S. Congress, the nature of the tax code, and so forth and so on. And you were saying, and I was agreeing, that there needed to be a quid pro quo if we were going to bail these big people out, but it didn't happen. You were saying, and I was agreeing, that there needed to be higher taxes on their income so that they paid a fair share. Doesn't look like that's going to happen either. Aren't these ideological issues, I want to ask? That's question number one. And then secondly, I'd really like your opinion on this. My instinct is that Hillary Clinton is less of a ideological or non-ideological politician than was her husband. I mean, I remember being appalled at that 100,000 cops on the street, school uniforms, the welfare reform dynamic that developed in the 1990s, and the triangulation that was going on. And I always had the impression, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Hillary Rodham Clinton wasn't gung-ho and enthusiastic about that she was kind of pushing against that to some degree. And therefore I held out the possibility that hers would be a very different kind of administration, much less cynical and in some ways much more in the spirit of FDR and LBJ than was her husband's. So those are 2 points.
Let me take both of your points in order. Number one, in terms of trying to get our democracy back from the lobbyists, particularly lobbyists representing Wall Street or money and moneyed interests, this doesn't have to be an ideological issue. In fact, I know a lot of people who call themselves conservatives and Republicans who say democracy is in a shambles. Corporate welfare is a disgrace. The earmarks are a disgrace. We should not be allowing corporate lobbyists and lobbyists for money people to control our government. This is not a left versus right issue, Glenn. This is an issue about taking government out of the hands of the special interests and making it work for all people. And I can tell you, again, my dinner companion, Alan Simpson, a couple of nights ago, and a Republican of Wyoming, a friend of Dick Cheney, was telling me how outrageous it is that lobbyists are overwhelming Washington, even more so than when he was in power. So we're talking about a set of policies that will rescue democracy. That's what Barack Obama is talking about, and he's talking about it relentlessly. Now, your second point about Hillary being more ideological, or at least more of the old kind of partisan Democrat than Bill Clinton, it's hard to say. When I was in the White House, when I was Secretary of Labor in the 1990s, she was his number one advisor. I got the impression that he did not make a decision without consulting with her, and that they talked through everything, and that it was not exactly a co-presidency, but certainly Bill Clinton's move to the right in the 1990s was part and parcel of what she advised and represented. She wanted him to sign that welfare bill, which...
that's news to me.
I'm sorry?
That's news to me. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying I had never heard that.
It was very clear to all of us. She didn't announce it, but it was very clear to all of us who thought that second welfare bill that the Republicans gave to Bill Clinton was still quite draconian.
Yes,
and
indeed.
It was very clear to all of us that she was supportive of it because she, like some of his other political advisors, felt that he needed to sign it in order to prevent Bob Dole from banging him over the head in the 1996 campaign and criticizing him for not delivering on welfare reform. Anyway, my point is that she's a pragmatic politician of the old school, and I admire her very much. I think she'd make an excellent president, but she is a pragmatic politician of the old school, and she is doing exactly what Bill Clinton would have done under the circumstances. She's running this campaign. In fact, he's practically running her campaign right now. And I think that if she's elected, we're going to have a co-presidency that has all the virtues and all the downsides of the Clinton presidency.
Yeah. Well, one of those virtues will be experience, and I was interested to hear you confirm what I've always thought, but what has been denigrated in some of the public argument of late, which is that being married to the President of the United States for 8 years and being a savvy and very gifted political operative ends up being an awful lot of experience at the top of American government that ought to redound to your credit. I'm glad to see that you agree with that.
I think she has had a lot of experience, Glenn. I mean, she is not a Nancy Reagan or Laura Bush or a Barbara Bush or even Rosalind Carter. She was much more of an activist first lady. Healthcare was her baby. I mean, basically the president turned healthcare over to her. And I think it's fair for the public to say, well, how did she function as a manager when she was in charge of healthcare? How has she functioned as a manager in terms of her own campaign? These are legitimate, legitimate questions.
The good comes with the bad, or vice versa. But I have one more question for you, Bob, which is this. How does a president of the United States, any president, stop lobbyists from influencing the Congress of the United States, which is, it seems to me, where the bulk of the pressure that we're all lamenting about getting democracy back is being applied? What is a president going to do about the influence of lobbyists on Congress?
Well, what a president is going to do is energize and mobilize the electorate to demand lobbying reform, to demand campaign finance reform, to require that we, to the extent that it is possible for us, to subdue and restrict the effect of money on politics. Nothing good is going to happen in Washington, Glenn, and I was there, I can attest to this, unless people, voters, citizens are mobilized and energized to make it happen. Politics of the old order, politics that is just kind of standard form Washington politics, is a closed loop. It is an echo chamber. It is dominated by K Street. It is dominated by lobbyists. The public is closed out. And cynicism in the public's mind is exactly the worst response because it perpetuates the system as we have it now. People throwing up their hands, voters saying, well, nothing can be changed. If they have that view that nothing can be changed, then nothing will be changed. And again, one thing that I find very attractive about Barack Obama is his capacity to inspire people to once again re-engage with politics and thereby create the possibility of taking our democracy back.
Yeah, that rhetoric is very flowery, but I just don't see how it translates into action. There's a kind of hopeful imputation here between the excitement of people at a bunch of college town rallies on the one hand, and I don't mean to be disparaging, I know it may sound that way, but I'm just saying, a bunch of young people coming out and being thrilled at the excitement of a movement, I don't see how it translates into the other thing. And the other thing being institutional change that actually gets rid of business as it used to be. I mean, haven't we heard this kind of thing before? So realism and cynicism are not the same thing. No, realism.
Well, let me talk about how it does translate, because there have been 2 points. There have been 2 times in the 20th century. One time in my memory, when people who are mobilized, when voters mobilized and energized, including young people, but not exclusively young people, have changed the institutional structure of America. One time was in the progressive era, between 1901 and 1918. People decided that they were going to take politics back from the machines. Political reformers at the grassroots joined with leaders nationally, Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, and Woodrow Wilson, and so forth. And they institutionalized many reforms that, at least for many years, did take democracy back. In the 1960s, we had a Vietnam War. We had a lack of civil rights. We had a country that seemed very much off track, and many Americans, mostly average middle-class Americans, but also some poor, some black, many college students, really did spearhead institutional changes in terms of voting rights and civil rights, and eventually an end to the Vietnam War. Barack Obama reminds me uncannily of Robert Kennedy in terms of his capacity to get people energized, not just flowery rhetoric, Glenn, but really in terms of getting re-engaged with politics in the only way that will change things.
So the objection I have here is that in both of the examples, the progressive movement and the movements of the 1960s, the key seems to me to have been grassroots. These were bottom-up developments in both cases. They had manifestations in, thousands of different particular instances on the ground. The civil rights movement, as you well know, I'm sure, was a decade and a half in the making. It didn't just happen overnight. And the anti-war movement wasn't led or created by Robert Kennedy. It was something that came up from the grassroots of American society in outrage against our behavior on the world stage. And this is what's missing here. I don't see a grassroots. I see a top-down. I don't see the beginnings of institutional transformation being fomented by thousands of people in the states and someone running for Congress and for, school board committee and everything in between, who have a clearly articulated program and ideological vision and a programmatic idea about how they're going to get it done. What I see is a guy, an attractive guy, giving voice to feelings that people have.
Well, I think that you're underestimating what's happening, Glenn, in the country.
I may be.
I think that many people at the grassroots are being given a sense that they may count, that they may have some power. And the progressive movement, you're right, was a grassroots movement, but it also required leadership. It required Teddy Roosevelt. It required Woodrow Wilson. It required state leaders. And it was the combination of grassroots and that kind of leadership that legitimized the grassroots that really made institutional change possible. Same thing with the 1960s. The civil rights movement didn't know exactly what it wanted. It kind of felt its way. Martin Luther King was not sure exactly what would work, what was possible. But it was because of that kind of leadership combined with a lot of white leaders, John Doerr and others, and finally, the leadership of Robert F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and
not necessarily in that order. Not necessarily in that order.
It was the combination of the grassroots and leadership. Or to take Vietnam, Eugene McCarthy and his courage in running for president in 1967 and 68, got that movement really going. It kind of inspired so many people. It was now possible to end the war. You see, you need a combination of grassroots and national political leadership, or at least state political leadership. And that's what I think is happening right now.
Yeah, and I have to say this. I know we're at the end of my time here. I have never felt so old as I approach my 60th year, as I've been feeling during this campaign, because the fact that I'm not getting it is making me feel like, geez, I'm getting to be an
You're
old
really
man.
You're really over the hill, Glenn.
Exactly, and I know a lot of listeners out there agree with that comment. So,
I look at I know you and I respect you, and you're still young at the age of 60. I'm going to be 62 in June, but believe me, Americans really, it's not just flowery rhetoric. I see it at the grassroots. I see it in my students. I see, yes, it is idealistic, but people really do believe that our democracy can be taken back. Anyway, Glenn, it's been a pleasure talking to you and catching up with you. And
my pleasure too, Bob. Let's do it again. Indeed. You take care now.
Okay, you take care too. Bye-bye.
Bye.